And we have a CNN exclusive. Sources say that U.S. investigators wiretapped former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort under a warrant from a secret court before and after the election. Joining us now with the latest is CNN's Evan Perez, Pamela Brown, who broke the story and have the details about why the government was listening to someone so close to the president. So, Evan, what have you learned?
Well, and listen, sources tell us that the FBI got permission from the Secretive Surveillance Court to monitor Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign chairman, before and after the election. Now, this is an extraordinary step for the FBI to do surveillance on a high-ranking campaign official. And of course, Manafort is now at the center of the Russia meddling investigation. And we're told that there are intercepted communications that raise concern about whether Manafort was encouraging Russians to help with the campaign. Now, other sources tell us that this intelligence was not conclusive enough. Now, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team has been provided all of these communications, Anderson.
And Evan, what do you mean by encouraging?
Well, there's a lot we don't know about exactly what was said, but what we're told is that the FBI has communications between suspected Russian operatives relaying what they claimed were discussions with Manafort, as well as communications involving Manafort. Now, none of this has amounted to what people consider a smoking gun in this investigation. There's still more work to be done to determine whether there's a criminal violation here. We didn't get a comment from Paul Manafort's spokesman, but Manafort has previously denied that he ever knowingly communicated with Russian intelligence operatives during the election, and he's also denied helping Russia undermine U.S. interests.
And Pam, what's interesting, I mean, they've monitored him two separate occasions, or two separate times, correct?
That's right. So the secret order began after Manafort became the subject of an FBI investigation back in 2014. Now, that's centered on work done by a group of Washington consulting firms for Ukraine's former ruling party, our sources tell us. And the surveillance was discontinued at some point last year for lack of evidence. That's according to one of our sources. And then the FBI at some point restarted the surveillance after obtaining a new FISA warrant that extended at least into early this year, we're told. Now, the sources say the second warrant was part of the FBI's efforts to investigate ties between Trump campaign associates and suspected Russian operatives. It's unclear when that new warrant started, but Anderson, as part of the FISA warrant, we have learned that earlier this year, the FBI conducted a search of a storage facility belonging to Paul Manafort. It's unclear what was taken after that search. And of course, then fast forward several months later, and then there was a raid on his home this past July by the FBI under Robert Mueller.
So, Evan, do we know whether President Trump spoke to Manafort while he was under surveillance? I mean, is the president, being recorded?
Well, we don't know exactly, but what we've been told by sources, Anderson, is that the president and Manafort were still talking early this year, well after the campaign was over. And during that time, the FBI was listening to Paul Manafort's phone, so it's possible that those conversations were collected.
So, Evan, was the president right when he asserted, remember, in that tweet, he said that,
right.
that I don't have the exact wording on me, but that Obama, tapped his phones.
Right, that his wires were tapped. Well, the Justice Department has denied that the president's own lines were wiretapped. But as we said, it is possible that he's picked up on Manafort's surveillance. And we should note that Manafort does have a residence in Trump Tower. It's not clear whether the FBI was doing actual surveillance on him in there, but you can see the president's supporters coming out and saying that the president was right all along.
Pam Brown, appreciate it. Evan Perez, a lot to dig into with his uniquely qualified panel tonight. CNN senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin joins us, who happens to be a former federal prosecutor. CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein, who helped break Watergate wide open. Former Nixon White House counsel John Dean, who was at the center of it at the time. And CNN legal and national security analyst Asher Ngapa, who was a former FBI special agent. So, Jeff, how significant is this, and how tough is it to get a FISA warrant?
It's very significant. First of all, just to get a warrant like this, you have to persuade the court that there is probable cause to believe, Asher used to do this kind of work, that this was the agent of a foreign government. Thanks to the Patriot Act, the law passed after 9/11, that information can be shared with criminal investigators. The wall between counterintelligence and criminal has been broken down. So that's why this information can be passed to Mueller. Obviously, what we don't know is what was the basis for the warrant. What went into the statement that the FBI made to the judge to grant the warrant, and most importantly, we don't know what was said. We don't know what Manafort said. We don't know who he was speaking to. But the fact that they got two warrants suggests that the first wasn't totally useless, because it allowed them to get a second one. But
so they would have had to get
be
two
cautious.
FISA warrants?
Absolutely. Based on Evan and Pamela's reporting, there were two separate warrants, one after the other.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, so when you get a FISA order on a U.S. person, the standard is slightly higher than for a non-U.S. person. So you have to show a court not only that the person is an agent of a foreign power, but they're knowingly engaging in clandestine intelligence activities, that they're basically knowingly being a spy. And once you get that order, you have to go back to the court every 90 days and show the court that you are, in fact, getting foreign intelligence information. If in that 90-day period you have not gotten that information, just in that last 90 days, the surveillance has to cease. So, as Jeffrey said, there could have been a gap where it ceased, and then if they find that there is other information that they're getting about his potential intelligence connections, they can use some of the intelligence they've gotten before, the new stuff, and then put in a new application.
How rare is it, though, that they would, have surveillance, but according to the reporting back in 2014, and then stop it because they didn't think they were getting anything, and then restart it?
I don't think it's necessarily unusual. Again, this 90-day period is there to provide a check so that the government just can't sit there and listen and just wait until something happens. If they're not getting it for 90 days, they have to stop, and until they can get something else that can corroborate or beef up. And in this case, it sounds like what started off as his contacts with the Ukrainians turned into additional contacts with the Russians, and that was able to restart the surveillance.
If I can just add one point. The FISA court has often been accused of being a rubber stamp for prosecutors. They don't turn down a lot of warrants. However, this is the real world here. This judge, and we don't know who the judge was, had to know that Paul Manafort was likely speaking to the president-elect or president of the United States, and they were not going to just willy-nilly give any sort of warrant.
That's absolutely right.
So I think the FBI must have had something of considerable interest to get the judge to grant
Carl,
this
I mean,
order.
it certainly seems like the big outstanding questions here are what exactly Manafort did that, quote, encouraged the Russians to help with the campaign, according to the reporting, and when exactly this second round of wiretapping began and then ended.
We don't know yet who the person is, or persons plural, who talked to Manafort, who were Russians or ethno-Russians. What we do see here is that the FISA court found reasonable cause to have this surveillance under extraordinary circumstances, and it's part of a much larger pattern that we're seeing of events closing in on the President of the United States, on his campaign, on his businesses, on his family, and we're also watching with the people around him their interaction with a raging president about all of this happening at this time. And what we know now is, because Manafort has been heard on these wiretaps, that this gives prosecutors a great tool to ask Manafort and others about these discussions. Why were you having them? Now, Manafort has a Fifth Amendment right. He doesn't have to answer those questions. But why were you on the telephone with this gentleman or people in the first place? It's a huge investigative tool. The fact that there have been raids on his house, on his storage facility. Look, Manafort has been in the crosshairs of this from the beginning, and at the same time, he has not even, I'm told, fully talked to his lawyers about many aspects of what he knows and what he might not know. There also is the whole question of, so far, no one in this investigation among the principals who are being looked at by Mueller, Mr. Flynn, Mr. Manafort, others, have so-called flipped and are talking to Mueller and spilling their guts about anything. The one person that's being looked at is perhaps more favorable to get some information from, I'm told, is Rick Dearborn, who is the White House assistant to the president for legislative affairs. That's not to say he's done anything wrong, but he was witness to some of the discussions that went into the airplane discussion in which the president drafted a statement defending his son Donald Trump that now is the part of Mueller's obstruction investigation. So what I'm getting at here in this roundabout way is things closing in. And when you have a FISA court enabling this, that makes the pressure on the president and those all around him even greater.
John, I mean, how do you see this? I mean, as somebody who's seen this from the pointy end of the spear, yeah.
I see unusual aggressiveness by this prosecutor. One of the things, the first reactions I had, I recall when I was cooperating with the prosecutors, they asked me to wear a wire and to go meet with my colleagues. I refused to do that. So prosecutors like wiretapped information or somebody who will go out and gather it for them. This is long before they knew Nixon had a taping system. So that doesn't surprise me totally. But we now have a much higher standard with the FISA court, and that shows the seriousness with which they're treating this investigation, and that's what I find most striking at this point.
So, John,
we're either going to.
So, John, when the president tweeted out before, terrible, just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism. And then he went on to say, how low has President Obama gone to tap my phones during the very sacred election process? This is Nixon, Watergate, bad or sick guy. Does he now get to say that he was right?
Well, it's a little closer, but it's not exactly right. I understand from the CNN's reporting that there was no evidence that Trump himself was wiretapped or that Manafort's apartment in the Trump Towers was wiretapped. So there is no evidence that the Trump Towers, as the president claimed, had been wiretapped. Also, the Justice Department and FBI, I believe, formally denied that charge. So it's a little closer, but not a horseshoe. At
right.
this
I mean,
point.
actually, it is significant that the FBI and the Department of Justice said that that the Trump tweet was not the case, meaning that he was not
a target. And even if Trump were picked up in this kind of FISA surveillance, he would normally be minimized, which means that they would screen out what he was saying, and his name or his identity would be masked in the communication. And the only way that they would reveal to anyone looking at it who it was that Manafort was talking to is if they needed to know the identity of the person in order to make sense of the communication, or it gave additional information.
Well, it would be minimized if he was not involved in the investigation.
Absolutely, that's right.
But if he was involved,
that's right.
I mean,
if he was just talking to Manafort about campaign strategy or about nothing to do with collusion or anything like that,
right? It would be minimized. But if they were talking about Russia,
that's right.
Trump would be.
So if it was
identified.
relevant to getting the foreign intelligence information and the investigation, then they would. But he still wouldn't be considered a target. That's a incidental communication.
So we've got to take a break. Coming up next, more on the raid that Carl mentioned and the aggressiveness John Dean was talking about. Plus, we'll bring a former top CIA Russia expert into the conversation, later member of the House Intelligence Committee. Tonight's breaking news and a CNN exclusive: U.S. investigators wiretap former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort under secret court orders before and after the election. There's new reporting as well tonight in the New York Times on details, including how investigators executed the search warrant on Manafort's home. The Times' headline, Mueller inquiry sets tone with shock and awe approach. The piece describes federal agents picking the lock on Manafort's home as he slept, taking binders full of documents and copying computer files. Afterwards, according to the Times, Special Counsel Mueller issued him a warning through his prosecutors saying, "We are planning to indict you." Quite a wake-up call. Back with the panel, and joining us as well is former CIA senior officer and Russia expert Steve Hall. Steve, first of all, I'm just wondering what you make of this, because part of the reporting from Evan and Pamela is that part of what the FBI is going on, or what Mueller's team is going on, are conversations among some Russians about what they had gotten from Mueller, or basically conversations among Russians. Those, I imagined, would be kind of precarious to put a lot of faith in, because people can be bragging about their access to an incoming president.
Well, first, Anderson, it's quite remarkable that the FBI, which is a group of patriotic, very professional, and very nonpartisan folks, had sufficient evidence to get not one but two FISA warrants to collect information, counterintelligence information, on Mr. Manafort. So that, in and of itself, who was the campaign manager at the time, of course, and that's quite remarkable. What was going on in those conversations? There's been reporting that these were perhaps conversations with Russian operatives. That would be something that if they had a relationship with Mr. Manafort, they would have not wanted to have had on the telephone. They would have preferred to have been as discreet as possible. unless, of course, they were simply trying to bring him along and had not crossed that bridge into a more discrete type of relationship. So those are all investigations that are ongoing, but it is quite remarkable that they had the level of information needed to conduct this kind of surveillance to try to find Russian operations that touched Paul Manafort.
Yeah, he was campaign chairman, was his official title. And I guess if it was 2014, that was before he was on the campaign.
That's
it was
right.
really on the second time that he was deeply involved. Jeff, the idea...
The timing of these warrants is very tricky, and it does not establish that this was done at the time that he was the campaign chairman, from what I could see.
Yeah, it seems unclear exactly when, because apparently that meeting that Donald Trump Jr. had, which has also clearly been of interest, that apparently, according to the reporting, was not on there. The FBI was not monitoring that or listening in on that. Jeff, what do you make of, according to the New York Times, that prosecutors have told Paul Manafort he's going to be indicted?
I think it means he's going to be indicted.
It's not just it's not a threat they would make?
No, see, my experience with federal prosecutors is they don't threaten indictments unless they are really prepared to do it. There's actually a formal process where you, as a if you are being investigated, you can ask for what's called a letter, a target letter asking for your status. Are you a witness, which means you're not going to be indicted? Are you a subject, which is someone that they're looking at? Or are you a target? Now, when you get a target letter, it's a virtual certainty that you are going to be indicted. It sounds like they either gave Manafort a target letter or told him orally that he is a target, and it's just not, I mean, obviously it's not out of the realm of possibility, but if in a high-profile environment like this, prosecutors told Paul Manafort that he's going to be indicted, he's going to be indicted.
Asha, you agree with it?
I think that's especially true with Robert
Let's be
Mueller.
clear about one thing.
Hold on, let Asha finish and we'll go to Carl.
I just think that's especially true for Robert Mueller.
ahead,
I mean, he's no nonsense and is going to go after everything that he can, but I don't think he's going to gratuitously try to intimidate anybody in the investigation. I don't think he needs to. He's going to get the evidence that he needs to actually bring charges.
Carl?
Can I be a little clear about what he may or may not be indicted for, because it's no surprise that he is going to be indicted. That it is very likely that the indictment will have to do with failure to register and follow procedures for failing to register as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And that the idea behind an indictment is to try, as might happen with Flynn also, under the same provisions of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, is to try and get Manafort or Flynn and others in this position to talk. It's not at all clear that these indictments that might be forthcoming would have anything directly to do with collusion with the Russians or even with a cover-up in regard to what's happened in the election with supposed events related to Russia. This, too, can be a tool to try and get more information. So I think we need to not jump
and if
too
I could
far ahead.
just add
What
one
we've
point
got-
that I think is we sometimes miss is, collusion is a word we throw around a lot about this investigation.
Yeah,
Was
too
the
much.
government of Russia colluding with the Trump campaign? There is no federal crime called collusion. It's not even clear that it's illegal for there to be some sort of coordination. It would be outrageous, it would be improper, it would be a violation of our traditions, but it is not clear that that's a federal crime. And I think that's one of the peculiarities of this federal investigation, that it is aimed at disclosing something that may itself not be a federal crime.
And I think there might be a little bit more than I think there might be a little bit more than the Foreign Agent Registration Act, because we know that when Manafort's home was searched, they took out boxes of documents, financial documents. You mentioned that they had taken photos of his expensive suits. They looked in the storage facility. If the only indictment that Mueller potentially had was for the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that would be incredibly surprising. It wouldn't match up with what they're looking for. And FARA is very weak. It only has a 5-year penalty. So I think that there's to be more on the table.
John Dean, when you look at the tactics that the Mueller and his team are using, I'm wondering what you make of them. Do you see them as being, the Times referred to as kind of an shock and awe, kind of an aggressive approach in some cases with some people, not necessarily with those in the White House now?
Well, I've looked at most of the post-Watergate investigations, Anderson. And I must say, this is much more aggressive than the norm. These are all high-profile investigations where the special counsel or the independent counsel under the former act knew they were in the spotlight during their investigation, that they were a certain scrutiny themselves, and they proceeded accordingly, giving a lot of courtesies to the targets of their investigation. That's not happening here. It appears that in this investigation, they're worried about maybe we have a spy in our midst, is what I'm struck, the fact that they've used the FISA court twice, and they're trying to root it out and not prevent any damage that sitting on their hands might cause.
John makes a really good point here. You know, search warrants are unusual in white-collar cases. Not unprecedented, but the fact that, you know, they would go search someone's house at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's unusual.
All right, we got to take a break. When we come back, more on Paul Manafort, the wiretapping. A member of the House Intelligence Committee weighs in on our exclusive reporting ahead. Well, we don't yet fully know how tonight's CNN exclusive reporting on the investigation of Paul Manafort ties or fits the larger puzzle, only that it seems to be a significant piece of it. To better weigh how important it could be, we're joined now by a member of the House Intelligence Committee, California Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell. Congressman, thanks for being with us. So, first of all, what is your reaction to the news that Paul Manafort had been wiretapped under secret court orders out of concern that he'd encouraged the Russians to help with the campaign?
Good evening, Anderson. The Russians were determined and sophisticated in the way that they interfered in our elections, and we want our investigators to be just as determined and sophisticated in the way that they unravel what the Russians did. And if they are not, the Russians will get away with it. So if this is, in fact, true, that's encouraging, that they're using every legal means available to understand what the relationships were between Donald Trump's campaign chairman and other associates, and even perhaps candidate Trump at the time himself, and the Russians.
Did you or anyone on the Intel Committee know that he had been wiretapped?
Anderson, I can't say yes or no to that, but you know, we are also seeking to bring in Mr. Manafort, as well as Roger Stone, Carter Page, everyone who was included on the June 9th email, and we've already, as you know, had our first round of interviews with Jared Kushner, and expect to bring him back.
So Robert Mueller and his team of investigators have provided details of the Manafort wiretap with the Intel Committee. Will they try to get that information as well?
Again, Anderson, can't go into the classified nature of our investigation, but I'll tell you that Manafort is important because he presided over a time of intense activity by the Russians. That's the summer of 2016. You know, that's when the June 9th meeting took place. That's when the convention occurred, when the platform change happened in the Republican Party that was pro-Russia. That's when Carter Page traveled over to Moscow with permission of the campaign. And, of course, that's when Roger Stone intimated that John Podesta was going to spend his time in the barrel, all a good chunk of the time that Manafort was there. So he was a central figure when Russia's interference campaign was at peak performance.
There is this report in the New York Times that when the FBI raided Manafort's home, they picked his lock, and that Mueller's team told Manafort they are planning to indict him. I'm wondering what your reaction to that is, if you believe there is a pending indictment against Manafort.
You know, that would be, if it's happened, it'd be under seal. If it hasn't, you know, of course, only the grand jury and the investigators would know. But you hope that he would, for the sake of the country, cooperate. And if he knows something about other U.S. persons who worked with the Russians, that he would be forthcoming about that. That's something we haven't seen yet. And what's so frustrating is that we've seen so many denials from the president and his family and the campaign about their prior personal, political, and financial ties to Russia, and have only acknowledged them when they've been confronted by either the press or House and Senate investigations. And so it's time to just be straight with the American people, and we would get to the bottom of this much faster.
Well, Congressman Swalwell, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. CNN,
my pleasure.
CNN senior political analyst David Gergen joins us now. David, I mean, as a longtime Washington veteran, I'm wondering how big a deal is the news that Manafort was wiretapped?
But listen, it's a significant story. You know, we're still in the preliminary stages of understanding it, but when you do need the top Justice Department officials to sign off on this, and it was started before Mueller got there. I think both those facts are very significant. It does raise the question of whether they're trying to flip Manafort or not, or whether he knows enough now. That certainly indicates that he's in grave legal jeopardy. You know, they had the wiretap, and basically they weren't able to come up with evidence, but then they were able to get a second time around, get it approved. That suggests there's something here, there's something incriminating, and he's going to be under a lot of pressure now to flip, and he may well face indictment, or he may face some combination thereof.
Do you think that they could be using, I mean, as it was suggested before, the charge of him, you know, working as a foreign agent without registering, use that as a method to get him to flip if he has other information?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the more they can pile up on him, the multiple charges, then the incentive to cooperate goes way up, as you well know. I do emphasize we're still in the early stages. There's a lot we don't know about this. It's just breaking, but it's a yet another dark cloud, and I think they get darker with regard to Manafort. He's clearly, you know, he and General Flynn appear to be two of the principal players. They're investigating very, very thoroughly, and to the point when you raid somebody's home, that signals you're serious, and B, you're going to take him down unless he cooperates.
I'm wondering, I mean, you know, as someone who's worked in White Houses, what President Trump must be thinking about this or reacting to this. I mean, on the one hand, you know, he had sent out those tweets long ago saying that, you know, he just learned that Obama was, you know, tapping his wires in Trump Tower. Something that Justice Department and FBI had said there you know, didn't happen, no evidence of. I assume he could now say, well, look, you know, there was some wiretapping going on.
There was, well, there was wiretapping under a federal court order. I mean, a federal court approval, and with top Justice Department officials and his own Justice Department, it appears. Maybe it's just the Obama team that okayed it. We'll have to wait and see. But you know, there's this additional question, Anderson, which I just don't know the answer to, and what I would think would be driving the president nuts is, how did he ever get past the screen to be made chairman of the campaign? If there was enough going on legally in the background that somebody should have gotten notice that there was something really questionable, if not fishy, about his background. Why they put him in there? President Trump must be really angry at his handlers for letting him get, you know, have the reins, because obviously the optics of having your campaign chairman while he's serving under FBI wiretap.
But at the time, it was a pretty bare bones campaign. I mean, you know, it was sort of freewheeling. I mean, they had Corey Lewandowski. You know, you'd go to do an interview with him, and there'd be Lewandowski there and Hope Hicks, and that was the inner circle. So I'm wondering how much vetting there actually was done on anyone.
Well, that's a very, very good question, but typically, you know, a more establishment figure would pick up a lot of rumors and gossip and know that there's something out there. And I think this is a vulnerability that Trump had because he was a newcomer fighting the system. So he didn't have the powerful inner circle of people who really knew what was going on in Washington advising him. So I do think he's got a right to be frustrated about that. I'm sure he's very frustrated just when he thinks he may be turning the corner, working with the Democrats. We'll have to see what happens at the UN tomorrow. But I think this is a blow to the president. It does send a signal that at least a couple of people in the inner circle, and Paul Manafort was in the inner circle as chairman for a period of time. They just can't deny that. That they brought in a guy who's under this much of investigation is pretty stunning. I've never heard of anybody being hired in a major campaign or White House position who was under investigation this way. And frankly, why the hell didn't Manafort tell them? You know, it was totally unfair of him to walk in there if it was not known under those circumstances.
A lot of questions. David Gergen, appreciate it. Thanks. There are also new details about how President Trump's own attorney is reacting to the special counsel investigation.